Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the readings for Epiphany, also known as Three Kings Day, which this year and every year falls on January 6th, the day after the 12 days of Christmas ends.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So since Epiphany is all about the arrival of the Magi, the wise people in the Bible, we thought that today we would have our deep dive be on astronomy, which is probably one of the areas that they were educated in.
Mm-hmm. And if you'd like more about Epiphany itself and the celebrations around it, we will link to last year's Epiphany episode with Jess Davis, where we talk about Epiphany and Twelfth Night and all sorts of wonderfulness.
Yeah. So the Magi, as we commonly call them, would have been educated in astronomy, and also a good bit of what they were educated in would have been what we now call astrology. We're not really going to address astrology today. We're not experts in it, and if we were going to talk about that, we'd want to have a guest on. But we can certainly talk about astronomy. And astronomy, as the Magi would have known it, would have been rather different from how we more fully understand how the stars and space and all that works today. So the first thing, of course, that people noticed in the ancient world would have been the moon in the sky. And the moon goes through two phases. There's the waxing phase, where it goes from the new moon to the full moon. So you'd start with the new moon, where you can't see the moon at all, and then you'd see a crescent, and then you would see the half moon, and then you would see the moon in its gibbous phase, where it's slightly larger than half, but still not a full moon yet, and then full. And then, of course, there's the waning phase of the moon, where it goes from full back down to new, full, and then gibbous, and then half, and then crescent, and then new, and you can't see it again. And then eclipses also would have definitely been known by the Magi, although they probably were a little confused about what was actually going on. But a lunar eclipse is when the moon is in the Earth's shadow, and a solar eclipse is when the moon is between the sun and the earth and is much more rare. A lunar eclipse can be seen anywhere on the night side of the earth, and solar eclipses are really only visible in fairly small areas on the earth. And of course, while many of us have learned that solar eclipses require eye protection to look at, lunar eclipses don't require any eye protection either.
One of the other cool things about the moon is that it is really helpful in timekeeping. So a lot of different cultures had lunar calendars. We have a more solar-based calendar, so it's like 1 year is the time it takes us to rotate around the sun. But lunar calendars are based on the moon's cycles. And so the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. When we think about like Lunar New Year's, or sometimes they're also called Chinese New Year's, is a type of Lunar New Year.
I think the Mayan calendar is also a lunar calendar.
Yeah, the Mayan calendar is a really complex one. So it's lunar, but it also takes into account other types of things. I think the Muslim calendar is also lunar.
Yes, it is.
The Muslim calendar changes, right? The month of Ramadan is the most noticeable for those of us who are not Muslim. And that changes when it is each year based on the moon.
The lunar calendar doesn't line up exactly with the solar cycle.
Yeah. So the way that Islam takes care of that is to just have the calendar be lunar. And every once in a while, there's just like an extra year that has passed or something.
Whereas the Jewish calendar does a little correction for that.
Yeah. So the Jewish calendar every once in a while throws in an extra bonus month to kind of toss the clock back to where it needs to be on the calendar. So it's fun to have this like right after our time episode where we're like, time is made up and also real.
Yeah. And for those who aren't very familiar with the Jewish or Muslim calendars, one way that the lunar calendar still affects Christianity is that the date of Easter is still determined according to the date of Passover, which is determined according to the Jewish calendar.
Yeah. So technically it's not based on Passover, but Easter is the Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox.
Yes, which is related to how the date for Passover is determined.
Yeah, but sometimes, because Passover doesn't have to be on a Sunday, right? Sometimes they're not always really, really close. Sometimes they they can be pretty
Yeah.
far apart
Yeah.
occasionally.
It's related, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
exact. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, the Magi would have been very familiar with drawing star maps, which are exactly like what they sound like. You look up at the night sky and you draw what you see. Although, I suppose, now that I think about it, usually a star map would look a little bit like a photo negative because you would be drawing where the stars are and not the darkness of the sky around them.
Mm-hmm.
So the stars would be dark and the sky would be light, which would be backwards from what it actually looks like. But anyone who has drawn star maps over the course of a couple of months can tell you that the stars that we see in the sky actually do change a little bit each night because of the Earth's rotation.
Mm-hmm.
And this means that you can also keep time a bit drawing star maps. I would also say, having done this for a class once, that drawing star maps can be a very contemplative experience. And if you have trouble meditating, but you still want some kind of contemplative practice in your life, as long as you can find a decent view of the night sky, drawing star maps might be an option.
Yeah. Also, you kind of get at this a little bit, Kay, but so the star map and what you see in the night sky does change somewhat from night to night and certainly seasonally and that sort of a thing. And we might say, oh, then it's obvious that Earth is round or rotating around the sun or those sorts of things. But because of the particular way that the Earth's axis is angled and just the like fundamentally not changing parts of the night sky. So even when the stars above do move position, the map is the same and just like shifts kind of thing. The majority are still there and present and pretty much the same. And so it can look like they're not really changing a lot. And so it would make sense that they might not realize that the Earth is round based on their observations of the night sky, even if they were mapping them. Also, one of the things that goes with star maps and would make a star map easier or more difficult, depending on your perspective, to do is the concept of a dark sky. When I was in Utah, I didn't make it to the dark sky spot, but I made it really close. There are places in the world that are called dark sky spots, and they are places that don't have light pollution at night. So this is very far away from any cities, any of that. A lot of times there are, like, if there's a massive telescope somewhere, that's probably a good indicator that there's a dark sky there. But they're few and far between these days because we just have so much light pollution and so many lights. If you followed Santa and tracked Santa in the Santa tracker, you saw a Santa going to places and it's so lit up and so bright. And that actually makes it harder to see stars. So if you're in a city or something, your star map might be easier to do because you just can't see as many stars versus if you're out in a very isolated place or in a place where they have really good regulations about lighting so that you have to, like, now they're starting to require lights that don't cause light pollution so that only point downward, that sort of thing. So you might be able to see more stars, but we'll link to, there's a website that actually, like, you can find the dark sky spots. So someday I'm going to go on a trip just for the dark sky spots, just so that I could, like, stay up and look at the night sky and see the Milky Way in greater clarity than I ever have before.
Yeah. And of course, one of the things that the Magi would have been looking for in the night sky would have been constellations. But while the Magi would have known quite a lot of constellations, and some of them would have been related to the ones that some of us might be familiar with now, most of the constellations popularly known these days, at least in America, are from ancient Greek myths. But the Magi weren't Greek. We're pretty sure they were Zoroastrians from various places around the Middle East. And so they would have known a completely different set of constellations. And there are actually several constellations mentioned in the Bible that we don't really notice or pay attention to today. I am not going to attempt to pronounce them because you don't need to hear my terrible attempts at that. But Wikipedia does have an interesting list of them on their website under biblical astronomy. And those constellations also have stories behind them, and I suppose they might not have wanted to call all of those myths back then, just like the constellations we're familiar with do.
Yeah. Oh, this is cool. Kima and Kessil, Ash, Hadra, Thaman, Mezarim, Mazarot, and Nachash is my attempt. I haven't taken Hebrew since college,
Sure.
but that's my attempt to pronounce them.
Sure.
But we'll link to that as well. Also, one like pop culture type reference is for Battlestar Galactica. A lot of the constellations that we know today play into Battlestar Galactica. The different planets that people are from, which become the different spaceships, are places like Caprica. So they change the ending just a little bit, but it is meant to be something that connects to the world that we know. And so there's similarities with different endings to kind of indicate the way language evolves between them. But they also use stars to navigate somewhat as they are fleeing the Cylons and then looking for this strange place called Earth. So
yeah,
that's fun.
Yeah. Also, now that I think about it, for those who are fans of science fiction from the 1970s, I think it was, there's a book called Lucifer's Hammer about what would happen if the Earth was hit by a comet. And one of the characters who discovers the comet at the beginning is actually a teenage boy from the Midwest. Apparently, in some rural areas in the 70s, it was possible to get so bored that you would start memorizing star maps for lack of anything better to do. And so he realized that there was a new star in the sky because he looked at the sky and there was a star that wasn't supposed to be there. And he knew that because he had memorized star maps at the age of 15. And I thought that that was an interesting way to bring star maps into fiction.
Yeah. That's really cool. That sounds like a really fun kind of thing. Also, speaking of constellations, fun fact, most things that we look at and think are stars are actually galaxies. They're just really far away. So there's a resource that I love every year that comes out that they have now renamed, instead of the Hubble Advent Calendar, it's now the Space Telescope Advent Calendar, because it has both the JWS telescope and the Hubble telescope making pictures. And so we'll link to that, but picture 15 in that in particular kind of talks about like how many galaxies are out there. So when you look in the night sky, you're probably looking mostly at galaxies, which are made up of lots of stars. Also, you might be looking at some planets. Many solar systems have planets. There's a lot of work being done to try and see if they have planets in the habitable zone, which is a certain distance away from the star that they rotate around. So it has to be a certain distance away so it's not too hot, but not too far so it's not too cold, where life, as we understand it, could potentially live and thrive. They found a bunch, but it's still like a complicated thing. And just because it could doesn't mean it does. All of that stuff. But also, we don't even know everything about the planets in our own solar system, right? We keep going back and forth with poor Pluto. I love Pluto. Pluto is a dwarf planet. It is one of many dwarf planets. And it just is getting kicked around on whether it counts as a planet or not. So my very educated mother, what was it? My very educated mother
just served us 9 pizzas.
Just served us 9 pizzas. Or my very educated mother just served us 9. We don't know for sure. I like pizzas.
Or just served us nachos.
Or nachos. I like pizzas and nachos. I'm going to vote for pizzas, though, because I love Pluto, because Pluto has a literal heart, right? We now have pictures of Pluto. There is a literal heart. How can you not love Pluto? But there's also potentially a 10th one that has such a large orbit that we just can't see it, can't find it, but that we can sense, like, the gravity of it pulls at some of the other planets sometimes. So that's an interesting dynamic. Also, one of the things that is unique about our solar system that helps life be able to thrive on Earth is that we have Jupiter. And Jupiter has such a large mass and is far enough out from us and from the sun that it sometimes catches the asteroids, the meteors that would otherwise potentially destroy the possibility of life on Earth.
If I remember correctly, I think we're also pretty sure that what is now the asteroid belt was once a planet that was ripped apart by Jupiter's gravity.
That sounds about right. I believe it. So there's just like a lot of unique aspects of our solar system in particular that make it possible for life on Earth to exist and for us to thrive the way that we do for now, right? We're trying way too hard to destroy all life on Earth, but for now, it's set up in our favor, which is really great. Also, so while most of the things we call stars are actually galaxies and some are planets, there are actual stars in the galaxies and in the night sky. So there are a lot of different types of stars. So there are stars that are solar stars, like our sun, and that's like kind of a medium-sized star. It burns yellowish. It's not like a really cool, pretty color like the other stars, but it's just kind of like average, is what I was taught. Whether or not that's actually true or just like our Earth-centric science is, another question. But then there's also hot blue stars. So these are more massive than the sun and they burn hotter than the sun. So if you think about a flame, the blue part of the flame is the hotter part than the yellow or red part. So they're more massive, they burn harder, and they live for a shorter amount of time because of that. So they only live a few million years. Babies, sure, if you will, says the 36-year-old. And then there's also red dwarf stars. So these are the most common stars. They are less massive than the sun. They burn cooler than the sun. And therefore, they live longer because they burn cooler, they burn slower. So they last a lot longer than the sun will. And then another type is the red giant, which a red giant occurs when a star runs out of hydrogen fuel in its core. Mostly stars burn by burning hydrogen in their core. So when it runs out of hydrogen fuel in its core, it has to figure out what it's going to burn now. And so red giants usually start to burn the hydrogen that's outside the core. And that makes it expand and become cooler in temperature, but also like puffy and bright. So it's some of the brighter stars,
right,
which makes it more visible for us in the night sky. And then the white dwarf happens when a star about the size of the sun collapses and it becomes a white dwarf. So if you look at the star Sirius in the constellation Canis Major, is a white dwarf. So that if you are a star map person or want to find it, there are lots of apps on your phone too that can help you like find and name stars and planets and stuff. So Sirius is a white dwarf. And then continuing when the stars collapse, a neutron star occurs when a star about 5 times the mass of the sun collapses, and it becomes a neutron star made out of neutronium, the atoms combined. And neutronium is supposedly what Thor's hammer Mjolnir is made up of. So it's very densely packed and would like squish Earth and the star and our sun and stuff, like just trash compactor style. And then the final type of star is, of course, my beloved black hole, which occurs when stars more than 8 times the mass of the sun collapse. And that is, they collapse so far that they just keep collapsing. We've discovered more about them in more recent years. So they actually like spew out non-visible light waves. So it's a complicated, like the light cannot escape them, but some other stuff gets spewed out of the poles, which is kind of cool. And I learned recently that there is apparently the possibility of black stars dying, which I didn't think was possible. But once they like can't keep collapsing in, once they don't have more stuff to collapse in, I think they kind of create space to dissipate. I don't know. That is a new thing to me. Pace was talking about it in one of our recent Horror Nerds at Church episodes. So I will try to link to that if I can remember which episode it was in. But yeah, so those are like the different types of stars. If you want a fun horror sci-fi type of movie around suns and stars, Sunshine is actually a really great movie. We covered it for Horror Nerds at Church, but the premise is that the sun is cooling down, and so teams of astronauts are sent to jumpstart the sun, basically, like to explode a bomb at the center of the sun and jumpstart it so that it provides the warmth that people need again. Yeah.
Also, if you're wondering what kind of stars happen to be nearby to us, Proxima Centauri is one of the nearest stars to our solar system, and it's part of the Alpha Centauri star system with 2 other stars. and it's about 4 light years away. And when we were talking about types of stars, Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf. And I was immediately reminded of a line from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when the Vogons show up to destroy Earth in order to make room for a hyperspace bypass, because of course you've got to build bypasses. They explain that all of the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display at your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years, so you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now. What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? Oh, for heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know? I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams. So, I'm just saying, maybe if we paid a little bit more attention to what's going on in our neighborhood, we would know more about what's going to happen next. You never know when that'll come in handy.
Truth. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy never fails.
Yes.
Yeah. The other thing about stars and what gets really exciting, particularly as we think about Epiphany, is supernovas. And a supernova is the biggest explosion any humans have ever seen because it is the bright, powerful explosion, aka last hurrah of a dying, massive, as in way bigger than our sun, star. They are usually 10 times more massive than our stars and leave behind a black hole or a neutron star at minimum.
Yeah.
The main way that they happen is through the explosion of a dying star. They can also happen in like binary star systems, so solar systems where there are at least 2 stars, where one of the stars is a white dwarf. And if the white dwarf pulls too much matter from the other star, or if the 2 stars collide, then the white dwarf will explode into a supernova.
Which sounds a lot like some sibling relationships I've witnessed, I suppose. Sorry if that hit too close to home for anyone. But the reason why we bring up supernovas today, of course, is because the Magi came looking for Jesus because they saw a new star in the sky, which subsequently disappeared. And we're pretty sure that this must have been a supernova. The original star must have been so far away that it wasn't visible to us, and then it exploded and became visible for a short while, which is what the Magi followed. Mm-hmm. And then the star would shrink down again to what is likely not visible to us, either a black hole or a neutron star. Mm-hmm. And so that is why occasionally a new light in the sky will appear or disappear, just like Jesus' star.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of the podcast, Susanna Porter, about this, and she said that she had read that they think that the supernova was possibly in the Pisces constellation, and that is the one that exploded. The next one that looks like it is close to being a supernova is Betelgeuse. So she was saying that she was really excited for Betelgeuse to explode someday. And I think it would be absolutely amazing.
But don't say it 3 times into a mirror, or else, then you'll have sudden appearances.
Yeah, that'll be a whole different kind of appearance. And I've now said it twice, so I need to pause. But yeah, so that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just not going to name that star again anytime soon. Yeah. So we already talked about planets, but also we're not the only solar system with planets. So there are lots of other solar systems that also have planets, and there are lots of solar systems that have more than one star. A binary star system, for example. Our solar system is non-binary. Because there's only one star. Yeah. Also, one of the other things about stars, in addition to exploding, is they twinkle a lot of the time. So stars usually twinkle because the light gets bent while it's going through our atmosphere. And planets are closer, so there's less air that they go through. There's less gravity to pull them out of shape. So you're more likely to see stars twinkle not only when they're stars, as opposed to planets, but also when they're closer to the horizon, because there's more atmosphere that they're going through. So there's more likeliness of bending them. Yeah.
So really the stars don't twinkle themselves. They just appear to be twinkling because of our atmosphere.
Yeah. Right. And if you're doing the more scientific, fancier telescopes and stuff, when they have planets or when they're binary star systems or stuff, they can look kind of like they twinkle over the course of time, right? Where they're changing position around each other, or something blocks some of the light and not all of the light, that sort of a thing. But that's in the super complex area of astronomy. Yeah. And the other thing to know about the stars in the night sky and the galaxies and the planets is unless you're doing the math and science of it, you can't actually know which stars or galaxies are next to each other because they're not all the same brightness, right? So it looks like, oh, this star is brightest, and it is probably a planet, honestly. But for the other ones, even when you look at a picture like in the space advent calendar that has just like a whole bunch of galaxies, most of those galaxies are not right next to each other. Even though it shows up on a picture, which is one plane, they're actually like light years, thousands of light years, millions of light years away from each other distance-wise. We just can't always see that. So
yeah, while I was looking up Proxima Centauri, I was kind of surprised to find out that actually it looks a lot smaller in the night sky than the other two stars in its system, but it's actually much closer to us than those two are. So, yeah, you'd need a lot of math in order to figure that stuff out.
But that is why some people go into astronomy or astrophysics, and why I have dreams of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And now, as we dive into our readings, our first reading is Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 6. The people of Jerusalem are called into the light of God, which will protect them from the surrounding darkness, and the wealth of the nations will be brought to them. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of global impact. In this particular passage, it is limited by what was understood as global, as the whole earth, but it just felt like a G20 summit or like a G8 summit or whatever, where like all of these fancy, special, powerful nations are all coming together in one place, and that's what it read as for me.
Yeah. So this passage begins with verse 1a. Arise, shine, for your light has come, which very much reminds me of the song Rise and Shine and Give God the Glory, Glory, which I would sing, except that I am currently dealing with a cold, and my throat's just not going to do that today.
Okay.
But
I'm bummed, because I really like that song, and I totally would have joined in with you. Also, mostly because I'm usually the one singing, but...
Yes. I mean, you're welcome to go ahead. I'm not stopping you.
It's okay.
Okay. It immediately made me think of when I read this passage that I used to be a night owl for most of my life, but when I started my ADHD medication, it changed my sleep schedule very significantly. In fact, it took quite a while for me to figure out how to have a sleep schedule again on this medication. But at this point, these days, I can only sleep in if I'm sick. I can't take naps unless I'm sick. I can't sleep later than my usual wake-up time unless I'm sick. I have a much more regimented system for sleep than I used to, and so I am these days a morning person against my own will. And so if your sleep schedule is all out of whack, I would like to point out that it might have a medical cause, and there might be a fix for it out there. So don't be afraid to go investigate. Because while I do miss being able to sleep in and I do miss being able to take naps whenever I want, I also am really grateful to have a more predictable sleep pattern, and I can count on being awake enough to do my job the vast majority of days. So that is very helpful.
Yeah, that tends to be helpful. In the second verse, we read, For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the everlasting will rise upon you, and their glory will appear over you. And this could be like juxtaposition of the everlasting as in God versus the darkness. But also it just, when I was reading it, I was like, well, it sounds like God is the darkness or in the darkness, which is consistent with what we know of kind of the biblical context and of God's holy darkness, the amazing, wonderful book. But it also reminded me of a story that Barbara Brown Taylor tells in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, which I love and recommend highly, as people who listen to our grief episode know. But she talks about being in caves. Like, part of what she did for the book was to like go to a cave, and the way that the caves are is like you can actually be in a place with no light whatsoever, and like the sensory impact of that. And that when she was there, then she started to hear this humming, and it was actually like her body's frequency. So I love this idea of like being wrapped in thick darkness as a space where like you get to just be surrounded by a space for you to know yourself, right? To be so very intimately connected to yourself that you can hear the frequency with which your body hums as it is alive. Really cool.
Yeah. And then as we get to verse 4a, we read, "Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together." And unfortunately, again, I'm not singing today, but it did immediately remind me of the line from the song in Hamilton, look around, how lucky we are to be alive right now." And even in those moments when the world seems to be terrible and messed up, that is also still true, because even though there are times when it doesn't feel lucky to be alive, there is still such a difference we can make in so much that we can do.
Yeah. And then in verse 6, we read, "A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense and shall proclaim the praise of the everlasting." And I gotta say, that's a lot of camels. And I do think that there is such a thing as too heavy of a weighted blanket. And they might have achieved it in this verse. The gold and frankincense sounds good, though. I'm all about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all about that.
I think we've read that verse before for this podcast, because I'm pretty sure I said something about wanting a gif of it, like in 90s style of just getting covered with a whole bunch of camels.
Yeah, I think so. Well, because it's the same reason
It is a fun verse.
every Epiphany. So last year we would have.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. And our second reading for this episode is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. The author declares that he is a servant of the mystery of the gospel, which is made known through Jesus Christ, to bring together the Jewish people and the Gentile nations into God's promises.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of new outreach, right? The author is talking about reaching out to people who have not necessarily been reached out to before. And it reminded me of like New Who or the Leverage Redemption series or the Battlestar Galactica series that I saw. And those are all like great examples of we're renewing this like outreach to people. I imagine that the Star Treks have a mixed bag of how effective their new outreach has been.
Actually, they look at that specifically in the animated series Lower Decks, which is very funny, and that's kind of an ongoing subplot.
Oh, nice. Gilmore Girls tried this and did not do a great job. Right now, basically all of the shows that I grew up with as a kid are trying to do this. Fuller House, that sort of thing. Full House to Fuller House. And mostly they're just doing it as like a grab bag for more money, and it's actually not been, in my opinion, super great. I have loved the ways they've done it with Doctor Who and Leverage and Battlestar Galactica, and that's how I've gotten into them. So there's a little bit of bias there, but like the other ones, I'm just like, maybe not.
Yeah, and also they never really seem to redo the ones that I want them to, for the most part.
Yeah.
Also
true. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 1 we read, "This is the reason that I, Paul, am a prisoner for Christ Jesus for the sake of you Gentiles." So Paul, if it's really Paul, Ephesians is one of those that is hotly debated whether or not it was written by Paul or people who were kind of disciples from the Pauline school. But Paul was an actual prisoner. So he gets to use the term, "I am a prisoner for Christ Jesus," metaphorically in a way that others of us don't get to, right?
Yeah. No, he was quite literally a prisoner for Jesus, because he was put in prison because of Jesus and talking about Jesus.
It reminded me of one of the characters in Sense8, Sun Bak, or the Korean wording would be Bak-sun, who is an actual prisoner. She takes the fall for her brother's corruption, and then so she's an actual prisoner for a while, and then even after she gets out and like does this whole like clearing her name, getting justice for her dad, blah, 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 there's a sense in which she still feels imprisoned by her life, even when she is not. And so I think that that's an interesting, like, the space and the people who do and can be imprisoned and have been imprisoned, and then also, like, are able to talk about imprisonment in the ways that we are all, like, pigeonholed into particular roles and those sorts of things is really helpful, I think. And then in verse 2, we read, "For surely you have already heard of the commission of God's grace that was given to me for you." And it's still Christmas now and when this episode is coming out. And so, of course, surely you know Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid and Donner and Blitzen. But do you recall the most famous reindeer of all? I will not continue because the point was the beginning part, but That was like screaming in my head, and so it's like, okay then.
Absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. Did you see there was a thing going around the internet a few days ago of a news station on TV put together a list of places with Christmas themed names, like a Santa's Village in one place,
Mm-hmm.
or there are like 4 different towns named Christmas in the United States, or various other
Yeah.
things. But one of the things they put on the list was Donner Lake in California, which is absolutely not named after the reindeer, partly because that reindeer's actual name is Donder with 2 Ds because it means thunder in German, but also partly because it was definitely named after the Donner Party. And that is not a Christmas themed
I mean, to be
thing.
fair,
So,
we had a meal with like chosen family back at the end of November, and we played There's a Donner Party game. So that was a holiday game for us. But
sure.
yeah, that's
But
a
you didn't
different.
actually eat each other, is the important
No,
thing.
we just pretended to.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Oh gosh, Donner Lake.
This is why having multiple people proofread something is important, because it's not always about spelling and
Yeah.
grammar. Yeah.
Fact checkers don't get nearly enough credit for things.
New. And then in verse 3 we read, "And how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I wrote above in a few words." And Paul uses the word mystery like 5,000 times in this passage. And he is not talking about a murder mystery, but it did remind me of the ongoing conversation around the movie Glass Onion that's been going on online for the last several days.
I have seen a lot about Glass Onion, but I like didn't even know it existed until all of a sudden everybody was talking about it.
Yeah, to be entirely honest with you, I have not seen Knives Out or Glass Onion. I was told by people I trust who know my taste in movies that while I do love murder mysteries, I probably wouldn't like Knives Out because I'm not a person who likes cinema about horrible people being horrible to each other. And there's apparently a lot of that in that movie. I have not seen the movies, but what I have seen is this recent social media discussion about what makes for a satisfying end to a mystery story. And being a big fan of mysteries in general, I certainly have opinions on that, particularly as a fan of the Agatha Christie style cozy mysteries. And I've always thought that the best ending to a mystery is one where most of the audience gets close to, but not quite the right solve of the mystery. You know, and you finish the mystery thinking to yourself, oh, if I had just noticed that one other thing, I would have gotten it exactly right. But I was pretty close. And that's kind of satisfying. And then also, there's probably still a few that figure out the right ending, but spend most of the story trying to convince themselves that they're wrong, or spend most of the story thinking that they're probably wrong, which was my experience with the movie The Usual Suspects. I figured it out pretty early, but then I spent the rest of the movie convinced I couldn't possibly be right. But by the time the solve is revealed, you do need to have given the audience most of the information that they need to make the solve. Although you can present that in confusing ways or without like really signposting that that's what you're doing, that you're giving them necessary information. So there are a lot of ways to do that. But if you solve the mystery with information that the audience never had, they're going to be really pissed off at you. So.
That's true. That happened with a book that I gave my dad once by an author who was using a pen name, but is an author that I don't like. That like we just legit didn't have the information, and my dad was like, that's not how it works. Like you can't just like withhold the information.
At the very least, you need to have hinted at it a few times. Even if you don't like just flat out give the information, you need to have provided enough hints to make it.
Yeah, but we just watched for Horror Nerds at Church for our New Year's episode. We watched Terror Train, which is a slasher, but also like a mystery whodunit kind of thing. And there was a red herring. So I like followed the red herring and I got it. I got the red herring. And then the red herring was dead. And I was like, uh-oh. But that was a similar thing where like, okay, there I could look back and see a couple hints of this.
Or like you can end a mystery and be frustrated by the solve, but still enjoy the mystery. Like I lent my husband my copy of Murder on the Orient Express once. I won't actually spoil the ending for you, but I will say that the answer is hinted at several times before you actually get the solve of the story. And it's not obvious, but like, looking back, you can see where it was signposted. And that was what made my husband want to throw the book across the room, not the fact that he hadn't been presented with the necessary information to make the solve. So he did not throw it across the room because it was my copy and not his, which is, a sign of a well-bred spouse. But
yeah, I have not read the book, but I watched the movie and really enjoyed it. And
yeah.
then looked, when the solve happened, I was like, ah.
Yeah, as far as famous Agatha Christie endings go, that one and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd are the two really well-known, oh, most people don't do that in mysteries. Okay, then, endings. And then in verse 6 we read, "That is, the Gentiles have become fellow heirs, members of the same body, and sharers in the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel." And the difference here being that since this inheritance from God is infinite instead of finite, which is to say it is not pi, we feel no need to murder each other over it like heirs need to murder each other in a murder mystery. Oh, wait, no, actually, we do that all the time. Well, okay, fine.
Yeah.
It was a nice thought. We shouldn't feel like we need to murder each other
Right.
over. However, if you do want to read a mystery that involves the heirs murdering each other in order to get bigger slices of the pie, 450 from Paddington by Agatha Christie is a good example of the trope and very enjoyable as a book.
Yeah. I don't know the 450 from Paddington, but I do love how much you're diving into your murder mysteries this episode.
Yeah, it's a good mystery, and it's known as the time when Agatha Christie proved that she could do a train timetable mystery, which was a whole trope of its own in Britain for years, because of course they do love their trains.
Because trains are awesome, and I wish we loved them more here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our gospel for this episode is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Herod, fearing a new king of the Jews, sends an uncertain number of magi to Bethlehem to investigate. Following a star, on arrival they worship Jesus, offering gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Thanks to a dream, they avoid Herod on their way home. I almost read that as Hagrid. And that would have been sad because no one should avoid Hagrid because Hagrid is delightful. So one of the themes in this passage is space. I know, we did it for a deep dive, but I wasn't sure if we were going to get to supernovas when I was writing these notes. And supernovas are awesome. Star explosions lighting the night sky.
Absolutely.
But I am here for outer space. I love space. I love the Advent Space Calendar that the Atlantic does every year. I love space. I freaking love it. Also, I got for Christmas, one of the things that I got is black watercolor paper with watercolor paints that actually show up on it. And there's one of the packs was just starry. And so it's all different ones. And so I can't wait to paint a night sky on this. And it's going to be awesome.
Nice.
Yeah.
So as we jump into the verses, in verse 1, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." And this verse reminds me of an early line in the movie Jupiter Ascending. "I was born of the house of Leo with Jupiter rising at 23 degrees ascendant." And it reminded me that we almost did an astrology deep dive for this episode.
And maybe we will someday with people who actually know it, which is neither of us.
Right.
And then in verse 3 we read, "When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him." Kind of like President Snow being afraid of a handful of berries in the Hunger Games, knowing that the power that he wields corruptly is precarious and vulnerable.
Absolutely. Also, I definitely misread that as a handful of bunnies at first, and I love that mental image, so that's going to stick with me for a bit.
I mean, that's like the Monty Python version, right? The killer bunny.
Yes. Nobody expects a handful of bunnies.
It's true.
And then in verse 7 we read, "Then Herod secretly called for the Magi, and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared." So if you're wondering, the exact time that the star had appeared would actually, for us, be numbered somewhere around 6 and 4 BCE. It turns out that when we tried to calculate the dates for when Jesus was born originally, we got it wrong, and we have since realized that error, but also no one actually wants to correct the calendar by 4 to 6 years. So instead we've just gone on being wrong, which sounds very human now that I think about it.
And also, we have shifted from before Christ to before Common Era, which is a much better. I'm actually a fan of us having gotten it wrong.
Global
so we
concept. Yes, absolutely.
Clear delineation.
Yeah. Sure. And also, Jesus was probably not born in midwinter. Various folks have tried calculating the exact date of Jesus' birth based on things like weather-related things mentioned and historical events and things like that. And the best guess at the moment, I think, is somewhere in early spring Jesus was born. But the early church wanted a holiday to compete with winter solstice and decided to set Christmas at December 25th. And there is a whole Wikipedia article on the date of the birth of Jesus, which is pretty fun.
Yeah.
So we will link to that.
Yes. Also, like, to compete with the winter solstice, but also, like, the theological imagery works a lot better for, like, the beginning of light coming back into the world and John and all of those things. Because, Jesus and stuff.
Yeah.
And then in verse 8 we read, "Then Herod sent the Magi to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage.'" I, personally, love kids and new babies and have a brand new one now in my life as of like 2 days ago, and will definitely pay them homage as long as baby talk is allowed to count in the honor and respect definition of paying homage.
As long as you're actually talking to a baby, I think so.
Okay,
yes.
Great. I'm excited.
Baby talk to anyone older than an actual baby, it really depends on the relationship, I guess.
Respectful. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, probably. And now, for our Starriest segment, let's make a Muppets musical. Did you have any thoughts on casting Muppets for this episode, Emily?
Okay, I'm assuming we're casting Muppets for the Magi.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Well, that means that Rolf has to be a Magi, right? Because Rolf is the most obviously black Muppet, and one of them has to be black, at least.
Okay, sure. That sounds great.
Like, you have to have your Balthazar.
Right.
Yeah.
I did see somebody tweeted they had commissioned, or maybe it was on Facebook, they had commissioned a nativity set on Etsy of like multicultural nativity set. And they said,
sure,
we don't want Mary, Joseph, or Jesus to be white.
No white people.
Because those are, even in multicultural sets, those tend to be the ones made white. And what they did was they did all very dark skinned, except for one Magi who had lighter skin. So they did just like basically a reversal from what typically happens. Yeah. So Rolf can definitely be one. I think that that's a great idea. I do think that Noor and Aziz would be great Muppets. They're yeah. They are the Rohingya
for the Magi
refugees. Yeah, Muppets for the Magi.
Are any of the Muppets especially into space and astronomy and stuff like that?
That's a good question.
Like, I feel like maybe the Count would be a good choice because, he's very into math.
Yeah.
Right? So he would be very wise.
There is, in fact, the Pigs in Space sketch.
Yes, that's right.
So
they are very fun. I don't know that they exactly love space, but they are certainly interacting with it.
Or is there anybody who gives really good, cool, or bizarre gifts?
I mean, New Zealand does, throw fish at people. I don't know if that counts. Also, I think Oscar the Grouch tries to give gifts a few times on Sesame Street, and usually those are pretty strange. And Oscar actually does, come across as wise fairly often.
Yeah, I love Oscar the Grouch.
He's delightful. You don't always think so at first, but after a little while, you realize, oh, you know what? Maybe he was right.
Yeah. I like this casting for the Magi. Because we can have as many as we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we don't know how many there were. Matthew is very fuzzy on that concept. Or fuzzy on that concept.
Oh my gosh, Fozzie has to be one.
I think Fozzie is wise in that he knows what he doesn't know.
That's a part of it.
Very Aristotle. Yeah, I was more focused on the Ephesians reading and wondering which Muppet would be the most fun to investigate the mystery of Christ. And, you'd have to have the little deerstalker hat and a magnifying glass and all that. And I really think Fozzie... I know that Kermit does that a couple of times in various movies and such, and Kermit does a perfectly good job, but I really want Fozzie Bear as the investigator of Jesus, because he would have such great fun with the slapstick comedy of, dropping the magnifying glass and, losing his hat and all of that. I think that would be... he needs more props in his life.
That sounds solid. I'm here for it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Baptism of Jesus with our special guest, Reverend L. Dowd. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than buying yourself a telescope.
True. Or traveling across the country to see a stranger baby born.
Or dark places, yes.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax Vobiscum.